Detransitioning, the new YouTube transgender craze. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and I'm going to be a tad bit late to the party on this video, in the way that Blair White made a video about this a few months ago. And even since then, there's been seemingly several channels sprouting up that are full of personal testimonials from people who have detransitioned, and this has been going on dating back well over a year or two ago. I don't know, maybe the channels just got popular now? I haven't really been following. At this point, the detransitioning videos have grown too numerous to name. The floodgates seem to have been completely broken, many of them have gone somewhat viral, and I realized that I was basically warning of this phenomenon about a year and a half ago when I first made my video, TransTrenders and Bistraightuals. So, after this all happened, and I called it as usual so long ago, what am I supposed to do? I don't know, I guess make this video. You see, it would appear that the chickens have come home to roost, and they've realized that after a brief stint of thinking that maybe they were roosters, many of them are, in fact, still chickens, and so they figure they should probably get off the rooster juice and warn the other chickens not to take it, even if a doctor is fine with prescribing it. On the subject of doctors prescribing hormones indiscriminately without proper psychological evaluation to see whether or not somebody would legitimately benefit from hormone replacement therapy, assuming that it was a doctor that gave somebody the hormones and hormone blockers and that they didn't just get them from the black market, assuming that these people who detransitioned actually did get their hormones from a licensed practitioner, I just want to give people a brief refresher about things medical professionals have also readily prescribed people in the past. Obviously, we can start with prescription opiates like OxyContin and fentanyl, responsible for close to 20,000 deaths in the United States by overdose in 2017 alone. Next, we have things we thought were somewhat innocuous as recently as the 1990s, like Prozac and Zoloft, which are actually extraordinarily addictive chemicals that have countless dangerous side effects. In the 1960s and 1970s, we had things like Quaaludes, which were responsible for countless deaths after people would mix them with things like alcohol and cocaine, and before that, doctors could legally prescribe both cocaine and heroin at some point. Now, of course, there are likely probably certain SJW keyboard warriors already furiously typing comments under this video talking about how I am a horrible transphobe for comparing the prescription of hormones and blockers to things like fentanyl, which are obviously very different things. And yes, I'll admit, there's a pretty big difference between HRT and all of the aforementioned prescription medications, but of course, the point should be obvious to any thinking person. Doctors prescribe things to patients that are not always in their best interest, and then years later, when hindsight is 2020, a lot of people think it's some huge tragedy and wonder why the doctors did it. Obviously, in the case of giving cocaine out to people because they had headaches, I imagine it seemed like a mistake. And why do doctors do this? Why does this happen? Why do we come across periods in time when doctors are overprescribing potentially dangerous chemicals? Well, in many cases, the drugs are new and they seem like miracle treatments when they are first put on the market. Cocaine was like that, apparently, as it both amps people up while also reducing pain. And some doctors prescribed it to basically everybody, apparently, until they eventually realized it had more than a few side effects. However, when we start to think about hormone replacement therapy and the prescription patterns associated with that, things obviously start to become much more complicated. You see, as soon as the innovation came around, doctors would obviously prescribe Prozac for depression and anxiety, as those were medical conditions that have likely been around for a very long time. However, HRT has largely only been popularized in recent years, as all of the sudden a massive population of people at least allegedly suffer from gender dysphoria, which has been around for a really long time, but this new wave of gender dysphoria, it is precisely that. It's new. Because, I mean, even just 5 years ago, most people hadn't even heard of the condition gender dysphoria. And now all of a sudden, we have Tumblr and YouTube blogs about being non-binary and how people are going to go on hormones for being non-binary. That's not necessarily a good thing. So what changed? Well, honestly, if you ask me, it would obviously be the presence of feminist lobbying and their close to complete takeover of media, politics, the court system, academia, and I guess eventually much of the medical profession. I have numerous videos where I go into depth about the root of these problems, mainly the one called "But There's Many Different Kinds of Feminism" debunked, where I talk for a long while about the postmodern gender deconstructionist feminists who are basically wacky Marxists that seemingly want to abolish the male gender by abolishing gender as a concept entirely. Long story short, it would seem that due to feminism's very deliberately inconsistent insistence that gender roles have no basis in biology and are socially constructed to benefit people with penises, except for all the times that they aren't, feminists have thus also ended up advocating for getting rid of gender roles entirely. Unless when it suits them, usually, of course, like when females get privileges based on being females. But let's just ignore the inconsistencies and move on. Now, getting rid of gender roles was seemingly first brought up by radical feminists who basically just said, "Kill all men! Who needs firemen and electrical workers?" But they were fairly easy to ignore. However, eventually the postmodernists came along in the 1960s and really developed all throughout the 1980s and even probably a little bit later. They haven't gone away. And they talked about all of reality being subjective, including gender identity. Gender identity is subjective, and due to the postmodernists' ability to be taken seriously in academia in a way that radical feminists never were, transgenderism became a lot more believable in the eyes of the academic world, thus eventually influencing politics and medicine. That whole process, how it all happened, is pretty complicated, I imagine, and I am no medical scholar around this issue. But suffice it to say that it was more than probably something that came about as a result of a symbiotic relationship between avant-garde medical academics who did research slanted with a postmodern gender deconstructionist bias and politicians who funded their research and lobbied for their findings to be accepted by the general public. Basically, wacky Marxists paying wacky people at universities to push wacky Marxist theories. And Marxist, postmodernists, not exactly the same, but very, very related, and they ended up kind of fusing together and having a baby. And the Marxist, postmodernists, it's just go with me. And thus, while it took several decades and this alleged progress rode on the backs of countless good doctors, scientists, transgender and or confused human guinea pigs, and well-intentioned graduate students who were legitimately trying to make the world a better place for people who suffer from gender dysphoria, eventually we ended up in a world where seemingly anybody can go to their family doctor, request hormones, and get them. But of course, as fun of a party as it maybe was when everybody on Tumblr was excited to start changing into their authentic self, The cultural come down is starting to come around, and countless people are now demanding that the medical profession pay attention to the stories of the seeming countless people who were not properly vetted prior to transition and now regret altering their body with chemicals and maybe even surgeries. Yes, it turns out that actions have consequences. In many cases, people do make mistakes, and gender transitions don't always cure underlying sadness. They probably almost never do. Nor does every case of body dysphoria require hormones. Nor does homosexuality. Looking at you, Saudi Arabia. Sometimes people have problems that there isn't a trendy cure for, complete with a reality television show. Who could have thought? So, what is my advice? Well, my advice for individuals regarding how to make themselves happier would be pretty obvious, and I won't pretend to be an expert life coach or whatever. However, regarding people who are confused about their gender, I can give a tiny bit of wisdom. Every generation, or even really every decade, is filled to the brim with people who gender bend at least a little bit and experiment sexually with homosexual desires. In the 1990s, we had goths dressing up androgynously, all sorts of drag queens, and ravers who would take MDMA and have homosexual makeouts frequently. I remembered those guys. I made out with some straight guys a few times. Last decade, the drag queens, goths, and ravers mostly went out of style, but we did have a lot of MySpace hair, emo, scene kid type people who, non-coincidentally, dressed almost completely androgynously and were prone to pose for photos at parties in homosexual makeouts with the seeming intent of impressing the girls. But of course, for the most part, almost all of that was just youthful trendiness and experimentation, and in the end, these people mostly did end up growing out of it and deciding that they wanted to be normal, heterosexual people who ended up having children and raising families. And thus, as a homosexual male who knows that I certainly cannot force myself to be attracted to women because I tried really hard to be when I was about 12 or so, and who will never have a family unless I adopt or set up special arrangements, I say, good for them. There's nothing wrong with bringing another human into this world and finding meaning in that. So think twice before you do things that could sterilize yourself or make you unattractive to potential mates. More so, don't give anybody super easy ammunition to say that transgenderism isn't real, because the same exact thing happened after the rave scene of the 1990s stopped being popular, or at least close to the same thing, and all of the kids stopped doing ecstasy and they turned into young adults and they realized that they weren't actually bisexual like they thought that they were when they were making out with somebody at a rave. And they became straight. And then they think that everybody is 100% straight because they were. And then they tell me that I could probably go straight if I wanted to over the internet. That happened. It was annoying. That's all I have to say for this video. Stay tuned.